Welcome back to Communicology. Today, I want to investigate why Gen Z thinks that everything is content to them. That might sound like a weird thing to say, or maybe even a shocking thing to say, but it kind of helps you understand the mindset of Gen Z and maybe helps us get prepped for Gen Alpha following after them. Before I start, if you wouldn't mind, please take the time to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I appreciate the help with the algorithms. But let's get into the content of our story. Today, I want to focus on this concept that came to me from one of my colleagues, and she had noted that to Gen Z, everything is content. And I started thinking about that, and it's kind of an interesting thing to wrestle with. And the more I thought about it, the more I said, that kind of checks out. So what does that really mean? I mean, the basic of it is fairly easily understandable, that everything that they see is just a piece of content. Okay, but let's dig in a little bit deeper to that. So whenever we look at the concept of content, we're looking at, basically the idea that it's information or ideas that is contained in some kind of a medium. So someone has an idea, someone has some kind of information that they want to put out there to the world, and they funnel it through some medium, and that's what we think of when we consider content. So when we hear people being a content creator, they're creating something new, or they're relaying some kind of information, and they're packaging and sending it through some medium. So again, when we look at the idea of medium, that comes from the ancient Greek medias, to be in the middle, in between. So like when you think of something simple like a medium-sized t-shirt, that's something that's in the middle. There's small, there's large, there's medium in the middle. So when you think of some kind of message system, a delivery system, like I'm using a camera, I'm also using YouTube, I'm also using a microphone. So you have all of these pieces and parts, these systems that are in between me and you. We're not talking in real time. You might be watching this 5 years from now. Who knows? I mean, so it's one of those things where there's something in between us. So that's the idea of a medium. So that's whenever we go to speak, we can speak synchronously, face to face, interpersonal style, or we can be asynchronous and we deliver it through some kind of medium. And even if you do live streaming or any video chat, there's still a time delay, and there's still something in between us. At the end of the day, we're not talking to each other, we're talking to a screen, and then it's digitizing everything and sending it around the country or around the world, and then digitizing it to a picture on their end. And we have that thing that we think that in our brain that, I'm actually talking to this person. When in reality, there's a thing in between us. But the big thing for most people who are millennials and older, and even not necessarily every millennial, a lot of older millennials fit in this category, sure, but younger millennials not so much. They kind of skew towards Gen Z in this direction. But the idea that whenever I communicate with somebody, I'm fully aware. It's maybe also because I study this stuff too, but fully aware that when I am face to face with somebody, I'm in that moment with that person. And I'm thinking of that person, and I'm talking with that person, and they're literally there in front of me, and there's nothing in between us. So whenever, again, you hear the term immediate, we think of the term like now, but immediate doesn't, the result is now, because immediate, meaning no, immediate, media, so there's nothing in between. So it's just clearly face to face. So it's immediate. So if I need you to do I need to speak to you immediately. That means without anything in between us, face to face. So that's one of those things that we tend to, comprehend. People who are used to doing face to face communication, we understand what it's like to talk to somebody face to face. But if you are raised in a world where everything is through the screen, everything starts to become content. And this is the basis of this concept that Gen Z sees everything as content. So again, Gen Z is real small. They're little tiny children, maybe even like toddlers. And instead of getting down on the knee and talking to them face to face, parents say, here's a phone, watch this video. Or I'm busy doing my thing, here's a phone, watch this program. Or I'm busy doing this other thing or talking to this person or whatever else I need to do, here's the phone, watch this content. I don't want you to cry, here's the phone, watch the content. I don't want you to ask me too many questions, here's the phone, watch this content. Well, what a surprise that child turns into a constant screen watcher, a content, consumer, on the primary level. So someone who's grew up before the digital era, primary content came face to face. So when you hung out with friends, it was face to face. When you got together and talked with family members, face to face. Everything was face to face. Sure, you could call and things like that, but typically you preferred to be face to face. You actually preferred it. Things started switching when we started moving into the millennials, and the idea of the phone started becoming more of a constant. So you start moving into the late 2000s, and all of a sudden the cell phone starts to become a common thing, and the smartphone starts to become more common. And as a result, with everyone having a phone and texting, remember the old days of T9 texting? Yeah. But as texting starts to become a common thing, people start becoming like, this is actually more comfortable for me because then I'll have that awkward face-to-face conversation stuff going on. And mindsets started changing towards how we communicate with each other. I'd come across a study once about millennials that 60% of them had some level of fear of talking on the phone. Not that they didn't prefer it, some level of fear to talk on the phone, 60%. Well, the big reason why is because if I have to talk to you face to face, you might ask me a question and I have to respond right away. Well, what if I can't come up with the best possible response on the fly? Well, you just had to work with it and deal with it. Well, as I soon as I start doing texting, I can sit there, receive the text, think about it, craft up a really good response later, and then send it. But again, that's all based on some false notion that we have some kind of control. As I always tell my students, you can control the message, but you can't control the meaning. So I can focus on working up on a good message, but as soon as I send it out there, someone's ears, someone's eyes, their brain's going to process things just differently because of what they've lived through and how they experience things and how they were taught. So the idea of that control is just a fallacy. But you see the trend starting. So all of a sudden, the face-to-face stuff, not so much. And then by the time you get to Gen Z, they're so engrossed to the phone because they've always had it put in their face since they were toddlers, and they then, start to see things in this world of life exists in my phone screen. Now, some people might say, well, Dr. Talbert, what about you? I mean, surely you watched TV as a kid. Surely your mom plopped you in front of the television, so she could do the dishes or laundry or whatever. Well, yeah, sure. So plop me in front of, Sesame Street or some, other things like that are on TV. But that was for an hour, maybe half hour, and then done. And then, natural state for most people, Gen X growing up, was get outside and go play, go hang out with friends, go do other stuff. Don't sit at home watching TV. What a foreign concept. It was a weird, for Gen Xers, that's a weird thing, just to get, the desire to be outside and free. Now you can't get people to go outside. I was just talking with some folks at church about how things like cruising doesn't exist anymore. I mean, like when I was a teenager, you'd cruise around town, bump into friends, you'd park at a parking lot sometime, hang out till the cops told you to get out, and then you go cruise around, find another parking lot, hang out, talk there until the cops told you to get out. But the whole concept was all about being face-to-face, being outside, being in the real world. And that was the big difference. So, yeah, sure, I got parked in front of a television, but, I didn't want to stay there. After a while, we're like, this is dumb. This is boring. Let's get out and do something real. Because we recognize the TV world is fake. Well, if you grow up and your primary mode of conversation is, and any kind of content is through the phone, you can see how everything then becomes content. So a conversation with somebody, content. A movie, content. A video game, content. Some kind of any other program, content, which sounds really weird, but that's the nature of the beast. when you're raised into that kind of a system, you can see that kind of thing being the case. So a 15-second, little TikTok video content, a 2-hour long movie content. It's like, wait, so they see the things the same way? Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to tell you that they can't discern the difference between a movie and a video and a TikTok video. Surely they can, of course. But the basic nature of it is content. I mean, you have this huge problem right now going on in movie creation right now, where people just aren't turning out to go see movies. Why is that? Well, the number one people who go out and buy movies are the people with disposable income. That's the youth bracket. So like you're 15 to 25, that group of people who just have extra money to spend on stuff like that, they're not going. Why? Because they grew up in their phones. They're used to watching movies through their phones. And you talk with some students and you ask them if they've ever seen a movie. Chances are they haven't, which is a weird thing because it's too long. They don't want to invest the time in watching it. And even if they did, they watched it in their phones and they don't get what the big deal is. Well, there's a huge difference. Again, understanding a medium, watching on a phone versus watching on a giant screen something unfold before you. Yeah, that's two radically different things. So, anytime you go see a movie, to see it on a big screen, to have the big stereo in there with the subwoofers that shake things whenever big things happen. Back when like Godzilla -1 came out, I saw that in the theater, and just, when you have something that's larger than life, like a Godzilla, you kind of have to see that in the theater, because to see it on a phone, it's like, wow, that looks really impressive. That's kind of cool looking. It's neat. It's content. I've seen that on a video game. It's like, well, no, on screen is so much bigger and scarier and much more intense. And then with the loud speakers, your phone has pathetic little speakers that have terrible fidelity, when it comes to audio reproduction. Oh no, these are good stereo speakers. Oh, and I've got good earpods. It's like, you can't cheat the physics. A 15-inch woofer is going to move air and create low sound waves that little dinky earbuds can't do. You're missing all of this material that's coming your way. Remember, like I said, the idea of content is the information and ideas that are sent. And if they're saying, trust me, you need to hear and feel this music, and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about because I've only ever watched it on a phone. It's amazing to see, things unfold in the eyes of Gen Z, because they live in this world where everything is content that's consumed through a phone. So, I've had situations where, like, I remember first, like when I got my first really good stereo, so you're used to listening on like a crappy little thing, like maybe a boombox or something like that back then. And then you get a real stereo with real woofers and tweeters. And then you start listening to your music again. It's almost like it's a whole new album, and you start listening to all your favorite songs and you hear things you've never heard before. Like, I never noticed that. It's not that you were stupid. It's just that the medium couldn't carry it. Every medium can only carry so much information. Like radio obviously can't carry picture. So you're missing, that whole component of it. And your phone can only carry so much as far as both the size and scope of the image, but also the sound quality just is not there. So there are all these things that you end up missing. But, all that aside, when you go back to the concept of content, you think of this concept of, if it's on my phone, it's good enough, it's what I need. And, again, it's you can see why Gen Z thinks that, because it's how it's been fed to them since toddlers. So, I'm always quick to say, don't blame Gen Z for this, because, when they're toddlers, it was their parents who did this to them. Now, once they become adults, they can make choices, but, again, it's content. And they get their brains are wired in such a way. Again, this is not them choosing to be stupid necessarily. Obviously you can still make stupid choices as an adult, and you could stay locked in something is wrong. But when you repeat patterns for so long, your brain becomes wired that way. The neuroplasticity of your neuron travel kind of gets locked in place until you retrain your brain. So but you're used to those things. So that's how habits are formed. So if you come from let's say, a really bad home, everything you see in the world kind of goes through that framework, through those lenses. If you grew up in a great home and didn't have to want for anything, you see the rest of the world through those frameworks. Well, if you grew up and everything comes through your phone, and everything is delivered to you through your phone, news, entertainment, sports, everything, well, your brain always goes for it. That's why people reflexively reach for that phone all the time, because you're used to, that's how you get your messaging. That's how you get everything now. I mean, realistically, when was the last time you even used it as a phone? I mean, the vast majority of the time we call it a smartphone, but most of the time we use it as a microcomputer. We don't use it as a phone. We send messages, we watch videos, we listen to music, whatever else we do with the thing. But we just typically don't use it as a phone that much. Especially Gen Z, they almost never make phone calls. It's just purely texting and sending messages to each other. And so you have a situation where, again, you can see how everything becomes content. So a movie is a Snapchat message, is a text, is an email, is a video chat, is a TikTok video. It's content. It's all like same level, same value. It's not like this is at this level, this is at this level, this is at this level, and this is this real special thing here. Like, it used to be really special to go to the movie theater. We'll wait till it comes out on video. But there's something special about going to a movie theater. They just don't see it that way. I mean, it's, again, people who are my generation, it's hard to wrap your head around, because it is special to go to a movie theater. It's just a whole different experience. It's just like, getting pulled around on a wagon versus riding on a roller coaster. They're two totally different experiences. But hey, I'm sitting in this little cart. It's not the same thing. They're two different things. But again, if everything is content, it's just, what's the big deal? And you can see how that radically would change communication patterns, how that would change the value of communication, the perception of communication. And, it's not a surprise that you look at a lot of the polling from Gen Z moving into the workplace. I did a podcast on this a while ago. Gen Z moving into the workplace, they can't communicate. They don't understand the value of things, and they don't know how to use the right medium to send the right kind of message. They just don't get it. They don't know how to do it because, frankly, they've never been trained. And also, as they move into adulthood, they don't want to be trained. They're content with this. So that's the last thing I want to cover, and that's the idea of moving from content to content. And spelled the same way, but if you emphasize the syllable differently, you're moving from content, again, that information or ideas created in a medium, to content, to be satisfied, to be happy. Now, typically we look at contentment as a virtuous thing, like you should be content in things. But the downside is where you start looking at something and being content in something and not recognizing its value, how special it is. And when it comes to being able to rank things, you have to understand that things have inherent value. We are meant to have face-to-face communication. That's what we're supposed to have. It's supposed to be that way. We are supposed to commune with each other. That's the whole concept of the idea of communication, is that we are with the other. So, you can't do the same things through some kind of medium. You limit a lot of things. The whole idea of all of your senses are at work when you're face to face. But as soon as you start going through some kind of medium, you start cutting off all these different senses, and it's not the same. So to become content with any kind of messaging, or just to be content with, hey, if it's through my phone, it's good enough. It's just simply not true. You're losing a lot of things, and you're missing out on a lot of things just because I'm content with living through my phone. So not everything is content. But that's one of the things you need to think about as you're working with and talking with, the Gen Zer in your life. That content is, it's just all this information and stuff that's been pumping along in my life, and it's all got the same value, and it's all basically the same matter. Again, that's a quick generalization. They don't obviously think that to an exact T, but that's how they tend to view things. So getting them to, trying to reveal things to them, to try to appreciate things, it's just one of those things that they just have a hard time getting. And I think I passed along the story once before. I was on a field trip, one time to Costa Rica with a bunch of students, and we were driving along in the tour bus, and there's a volcano out the window. And I said, "Oh my goodness, guys, look, there's a volcano." And they're like, "Yeah." And they just get back to their phones. I'm like, "But it's a volcano." I'm like, "Yeah, we saw it." Like, they saw it one time. That's it. Done. And it was just content. And like I couldn't get, I'm like, when's the next time you might ever see a volcano? At least look at it for 20 seconds. Stare at it. Just take it in. It's a big, beautiful wonder of Earth. Now, they look for not even 2 seconds, 1 second back, and that was it. They consumed that piece of content onward. Again, it just kind of shows that that's what you're dealing with when you're working with Gen Z. So we have to figure out how to kind of reel them back into the real world, to snap them out of it, to show that there's so much more than just living in a phone. And again, don't blame them because they were raised that way, and so blame their parents. But when they start becoming adults, they have to start accepting some of the blame, because they need to start changing and realize there's so much more to life than content. There's so much more to life than just things that are pumped through a phone. And we have to make sure that we don't do this, repeat these same mistakes with Gen Alpha and Beta, who are now just being born, and all those folks that they're kind of come after them. We need to make sure we keep them in the real world and experiencing real life and valuing what that really is. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in anyway. But I'll see you next time on Communicology.